Vicki Johnson from David Trotter. Vicki had been bleeding for 2 years. When I made a trip to see her, she told me she was afraid to go to the doctor because of the potential costs. By the time she was diagnosed, she had lung, brain, and ovarian cancer. She only lived about 3 months after that. To see the terror in her eyes as she dealt with this is something no civilized person could match or could watch, and then deny her the help she needed. David adds, "I'm ashamed of my country." Let's hear about Cindy Ray from David Twiggs. Cindy was a custodian who worked for Southeastern Custodial Services in Knoxville, Tennessee. They had Knox County government custodial contracts. I worked for the Election Commission in Knox County, and Cindy was assigned to our building. The contractor, non-union of course, did not provide insurance for its workers at Cindy's level. I know this because one of the employees who works in the HR department of this company was my daughter's best friend in high school. Cindy had a heart condition, and she had to take medication regularly to survive. She did a good job, and she was always friendly. One day, she didn't come into work. We found out later that day that her teenage son found her dead in bed. He was a senior in high school. Cindy couldn't afford her medication as it was prescribed, so she just alternated her medications to make them last longer. She was not educated enough to realize that this made the medication not work as intended. Not having health care killed Cindy and left an indelible impression upon her son. I cry every time I think of her. Let's hear now from Sandra Chung about Michelle Marie Pavlik, 23 years old, Norwich, Connecticut. Michelle was working poor with a cardiac condition, mitral regurgitation. She couldn't get insurance for one reason. She was denied for pre-existing condition. She tried to find other insurers, but she couldn't afford the premiums that would be more than 3/4 of her income. She could barely afford the medication, and she often had to choose between her food and her medication. She tried to get state aid, but she earned $15 above the poverty level, so she was denied. She was 6 months pregnant. She caught bronchitis. She went to the ER, but she couldn't get a doctor to take her on as a new patient because she didn't have insurance, and she was a high-risk patient with a pre-existing condition. She made it clear she was in cardiac alert. She even had a medical alert bracelet. People with a cardiac problem, when they get an infection, no matter how minor, they're supposed to be given massive doses of antibiotics and consult with a cardiologist and be monitored to make sure that the infection didn't spread to her heart or other organs. The ER doctor listened to her lungs, pronounced she had bronchitis, gave her some Sudafed, a cough medicine over the counter. No antibiotics, no consult with a cardiologist, no EEG monitoring. Without a prescription for her much-needed antibiotics, the infection spread to her heart, her kidneys, and her liver. She gave birth almost 3 months premature. My nephew, Andrew Michael, died at 10 days old. And she died from an aneurysm caused by the infection passing the blood-brain barrier. In the space of 1 week, I became an aunt and then an only child. Suzanne McKnight writes to us about Gregory Scott in Franklin, Tennessee, 42 years old. 2.5 years ago, my 42-year-old son died of coronary artery disease. He had been downsized 3 years before, and he'd lost his insurance. Since he had diabetes, he could not afford insurance, and he couldn't get a job either because of a terrible job market. He stopped getting regular checkups because his money was running out, and he was embarrassed to ask his family for help. He died 2 days after Christmas of 2006, and his doctors spent many nights going over anything that he'd missed in the records. Greg might have been saved had his insurance followed him when he lost his job, or he might have been saved if he could have afforded insurance. He was the middle of my 3 sons, and we've never gotten over his sudden loss, and probably never will. John Godwin writes to us about Roger Godwin, 70 years old, of Andover, New Hampshire. My father, Roger Godwin, died this past summer due to problems with our health care system. He did have insurance, but he was the victim of a system that is focused more on the bottom line than care. He experienced severe pain in his back, but he was denied access to an MRI, and physical therapy was prescribed instead. Physical therapy is not effective when the problem is a tumor growing next to your spine, and worse, does nothing to detect this threatening condition before it begins to spread. And spread it did, eventually leading to tumors in my father's lungs, brain, liver, and most painfully, in his bones. He fought hard, but he died after a painful struggle lasting almost a year. My father was a veteran of the Korean War, active in local government, and he gave to his community in a myriad of other ways. He was greatly beloved by his family and those in his community. He deserved better. And John Godwin says, we deserve better. Joel Witherspoon wrote to us about Louis Bruce Witherspoon, 61 years old, of Anaheim, California. For 17 years, my father worked as a major utility here in California. He worked for a major utility. At the age of 51, he was laid off, and he spent 6 years looking for work and surviving on help from me and a meager retirement. He finally found work at 57, working for Tenet Healthcare as a computer technician. It was humiliating work, but it was work. In order to cut costs, Tenet Healthcare kept him on part-time for 6 years without benefits. He was given favorable reviews, but when he applied for full-time positions with benefits, they were given to younger and less costly employees. In the middle of his 6th year, he began to develop respiratory issues that became progressively worse until he finally collapsed in the parking lot of the hospital where he worked. After a week of testing, it was discovered that he had terminal prostate cancer. The cancer had metastasized to his lungs, his liver, and his brain. The doctors gave him only a few months to live. No doctor at the hospital would treat him. When pressed for answers, his boss and higher-ups clammed up. We couldn't get any information out of any of them. After 3 months, he passed away in a hospital in Inglewood. Let's hear now from Courtney Hemlick of Port St. Lucie, Florida, about Chris Aligits. She wrote as follows. The love of my life and my dear best friend took his own life this year on May 9, 2009. He had a long-term drug abuse and mental health problem. He and his family tried to get him help over and over again with no luck because he had no health insurance. He could not afford mental health care on his own, living on unemployment and unable to find new work, due in part to the economy and in part to his mental health issues. On Tuesday, May 5, 2009, he and his mother went to a local mental health clinic asking for help because he was becoming worse. They were turned away due to an inability to pay and a lack of insurance. That Saturday, 5 days later, my friend took his own life. After many attempts for help and being rejected over and over, he felt there was no way out of his own mental health misery. Something needs to be done. My friend has just as much right to health care as anyone. And then Courtney writes, as we all do.